The man in black stood before the weathered church like death itself waiting at heaven's door. Martha's hands were slick with blood. Not hers. Not yet. Behind that locked door, 7 voices screamed in the darkness. Voices the whole town had learned to ignore. She had one choice left: break down the door and face what lurked in that basement, or walk away like everyone else had. The crowbar felt heavy as a coffin nail in her grip. This was the moment an entire community had been running from for 3 years. And she was done running. If you want to know how a single man turned an entire valley into his personal nightmare, how faith became a weapon sharper than any blade, and why this story was buried so deep that history itself forgot it existed, then keep watching. Because what happened in Hollow Creek will make you question everything you thought you knew about evil. In the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, where mountains swallow the sun by 4 in the afternoon, there once lived a preacher named Amos Kettering. His story was buried so deep that even the oldest families refused to speak his name. What he did in that isolated valley was so terrible that an entire community chose to forget rather than remember. Kettering arrived in Hollow Creek in the spring of 1952. He was 47 years old, tall and lean, with eyes that seemed to look straight through a person's soul. The small mountain community had been without a preacher for 2 years, and his arrival felt like an answered prayer. The old church on Miller's Ridge had stood empty, its paint peeling and its pews gathering dust. When Kettering stepped through those doors, the townspeople believed their spiritual drought had finally ended. He had a voice that could shake the rafters. When he preached, even the children sat perfectly still, hanging on every word. His sermons weren't like the gentle teachings the community had known before. Kettering spoke of fire and judgment, of sins hidden in the darkest corners of the heart, of a God who watched every move and weighed every thought. People left his services feeling both terrified and cleansed, as if they had been stripped bare and rebuilt. The town of Hollow Creek was perfect for a man like Kettering. It sat in a valley so remote that mail came only twice a week. The nearest proper town was 30 miles away over treacherous mountain roads that became impassable in winter. Most families had lived there for generations, never traveling more than 50 miles from where they were born. They trusted their preacher the way they trusted the turning of seasons. To doubt him would be to doubt the very foundation of their world. Within months, Kettering had woven himself into every aspect of community life. He visited homes, prayed with the sick, and counseled troubled marriages. He had an uncanny ability to sense people's deepest fears and secrets, as if he could read their thoughts. When he spoke to you privately, his voice dropped to a whisper that made your skin prickle. He would lean in close and tell you exactly what you needed to hear, exactly what would make you trust him completely. The families of Hollow Creek began to depend on him for everything. Should they sell their timber? Ask Preacher Kettering. Was their daughter ready to marry? Preacher Kettering would know. The old traditions and folk wisdom that had guided these mountain people for centuries slowly faded, replaced by one man's word. He became their compass, their judge, and their connection to the divine. By the end of his first year, something had shifted in Hollow Creek. The laughter that once echoed through the valley grew quieter. Neighbors who had once gathered on porches to share stories now hurried past each other with nervous nods. Children played closer to their homes, always within shouting distance. The church services grew longer, sometimes lasting 4 or 5 hours, with Kettering pacing the pulpit like a caged animal, his voice rising and falling in hypnotic waves. No one questioned it. No one dared, because Kettering had convinced them that to question him was to question God himself. And in a place as isolated as Hollow Creek, where the mountains pressed in from all sides and the outside world felt like a distant dream, the preacher's word had become absolute law. The trap had been set, and every soul in that valley had walked willingly into it. The changes began slowly, like water seeping through cracks in stone. Kettering started adding new rules, calling them divine revelations he received during his midnight prayers. The community accepted each one without question, believing they were climbing closer to heaven with every restriction. First came the confession sessions. Every family had to meet with Kettering privately once a week. These weren't gentle conversations. He demanded complete honesty about every thought, every moment of anger, every flash of doubt. Parents confessed their frustrations with their children. Wives admitted their resentments toward their husbands. Teenagers revealed their secret crushes and rebellious thoughts. Kettering listened to it all, his face stern, taking notes in a leather journal he always carried. He used this information like a weapon. During Sunday services, he would speak in vague terms about sins he had heard in confession, never naming names, but giving enough detail that everyone knew exactly who he meant. The shame was unbearable. People started watching each other constantly, terrified that their private struggles would become public humiliation. Trust between neighbors evaporated like morning mist. Then Kettering banned music, not just in church, but everywhere. Radios were sinful, he declared, because they brought the corrupt outside world into pure homes. Singing outside of hymns was vanity, a celebration of the self rather than God. The mountain community had always been rich with folk songs and ballads passed down through generations. Now, silence replaced melody. Mothers stopped humming to their babies. Fathers no longer sang while they worked. The valley became eerily quiet. Next, he controlled their reading. The only book allowed was the Bible, and only the passages Kettering approved. He collected every other book in Hollow Creek, claiming they were filled with dangerous ideas. Families handed over their precious few volumes, textbooks and story collections, and family Bibles with birth records going back 100 years. Kettering burned them all in a massive bonfire behind the church. The smoke rose thick and black, carrying away pieces of the community's history. He regulated their clothing, their food, their work schedules. Women had to cover their hair at all times. Men couldn't grow their beards past a certain length. Children were forbidden from playing games that involved competition because pride was sinful. Families could only eat meat on Sundays, and even then, only after a special prayer session with Kettering. Every aspect of life became controlled, measured, and judged. The preacher also demanded financial devotion. Tithing wasn't enough anymore. He required families to donate half their income to the church. When people struggled to feed their children, Kettering called it a test of faith. He said God would provide for those who were truly devoted. Meanwhile, he built himself a large house next to the church, far grander than any other building in Hollow Creek. He ate well while his congregation grew thin. Anyone who hesitated or questioned faced immediate consequences. Kettering would single them out during services, calling them agents of darkness trying to corrupt the faithful. The community would turn on the doubter instantly, shunning them completely. In a place like Hollow Creek, where survival depended on neighbors helping each other. Being shunned was a death sentence. People learned quickly that obedience was the only option. What made it all worse was how Kettering framed everything as love. He would say these rules were protecting them, saving them from eternal suffering. He convinced them that their misery in this life was proof of their righteousness. The more they suffered under his control, the more devoted they became, believing their pain was purifying their souls. He had created a prison where the inmates loved their chains. The first person to vanish was Thomas Hadley, a young man of 19 who had started asking uncomfortable questions. He wondered aloud why Preacher Kettering needed such a fine house while families went hungry. He suggested that maybe some of the rules seemed more about control than faith. His father immediately reported the conversation to Kettering, fearing that protecting his son would doom the entire family. That Sunday, Kettering spoke about Judas, the disciple who betrayed Christ. He said that sometimes Satan planted seeds of doubt in young minds, turning them into weapons against the faithful. He announced that Thomas had been called away on a special spiritual journey, a period of isolated prayer and fasting in the deep woods to cleanse his corrupted thoughts. The family nodded sadly, accepting this explanation. Thomas was never seen again. 3 months later, Margaret Cole disappeared. She was a widow who had been quietly helping families that couldn't meet Kettering's financial demands, sharing her small savings to keep children fed. When Kettering discovered this, he called it an act of defiance, a suggestion that his teachings were too harsh. Margaret tried to defend herself, saying she was simply showing Christian charity. Kettering declared that she was putting worldly comfort above spiritual growth, enabling weakness instead of building faith. Margaret left for her sister's house in another county, or so Kettering told everyone. He said she had chosen earthly family over her spiritual family, a terrible sin. Her house was given to another family, and her name was struck from church records. When her sister wrote letters asking about Margaret, Kettering intercepted them and never replied. No one thought to question it. No one dared. The pattern continued through that terrible year. Samuel Briggs disappeared after he was caught reading an old newspaper he had hidden in his barn. Kettering said Samuel had been consumed by curiosity about the sinful outside world and had run away to chase temptation. Rebecca Marsh vanished after she refused to confess a sin Kettering insisted she had committed. He claimed she had been taken by God as a warning to others about the price of lying to a holy servant. Each disappearance had an explanation that the community accepted without investigation. These people had left voluntarily, or they were on spiritual retreats, or God had removed them for the good of the faithful. Kettering always had an answer, always had a sermon ready that made their absence seem like part of a divine plan. The fear in Hollow Creek grew thicker than fog. Families stopped talking about the missing. Even mentioning their names felt dangerous, like it might draw Kettering's attention. Parents warned their children never to speak of those who had gone, as if the disappeared had never existed at all. Photos were turned face down. Belongings were quietly burned. The community became experts at erasing people from memory. But in the darkest hours of night, when the mountains pressed close and the wind howled through the valley, people lay awake wondering. They remembered Thomas's laugh, Margaret's kindness, Samuel's stories, Rebecca's hymn-singing voice. They wondered where these people had truly gone. And deep in their hearts, beneath the layers of fear and forced faith, a terrible suspicion began to grow. Something was very wrong in Hollow Creek. Something evil walked among them wearing the robes of righteousness, and they were all too terrified to name it. Behind the church on Miller's Ridge, Kettering had built a small structure that he called the meditation house. He said it was a place for deep prayer and spiritual contemplation, a place where the most troubled souls could isolate themselves and commune directly with God. The building had no windows, only one door, and only Kettering held the key. He forbade anyone from approaching the meditation house without his permission. He said the spiritual work happening inside was so sacred that even glimpsing it could corrupt an unprepared soul. The community obeyed, giving the small building a wide berth, never questioning what happened behind those walls. At night, sometimes people living near the church thought they heard sounds drifting from that direction. Crying maybe, or praying. They told themselves it was just the wind playing tricks. Kettering spent hours there, especially after someone had questioned him or broken one of his rules. He would escort the person to the meditation house, speaking softly about redemption and purification. Hours later, he would emerge alone, looking exhausted but satisfied. Sometimes the person would come out days later, thin and shaking, refusing to speak about what had happened. Sometimes they never came out at all. The truth about the meditation house was darker than anyone imagined. Inside, Kettering had created a place of systematic psychological torture. He would lock people in complete darkness for days, visiting only to deliver sermons about their sins and worthlessness. He would deprive them of sleep with constant noise, or food until they were weak and hallucinating. He convinced them that they were experiencing holy visions when they were actually suffering from deprivation and terror. He had also dug a basement beneath the meditation house, a hidden chamber that no one in Hollow Creek knew existed. This was where the disappeared had gone. Not all of them had died. Some were locked in that darkness, broken and forgotten, kept alive on minimal food and water. Kettering would visit them occasionally, using them as examples in his own twisted mind of souls too corrupted to save. People who proved that even a holy servant sometimes had to remove evil permanently. The basement became his secret, his terrible collection of failures. He justified it as righteous judgment, convinced himself that he was doing God's work by removing corruption from his flock. But the truth was simpler and more horrifying. Amos Kettering had discovered that he enjoyed having complete power over other human beings. He liked watching them break. He liked being the one who decided who lived and who disappeared. The religious justification was just a costume for a monster who had found the perfect hunting ground. By the spring of 1955, 7 people were trapped in that basement. They had given up hoping for rescue. Most of them had lost their minds, talking to shadows and forgotten memories. Kettering kept them quiet with threats and occasional violence. He told them their families had forgotten them, that no one was looking, that they were already dead to the world above. And he was right. Hollow Creek had become so skilled at erasing the disappeared that these prisoners truly had been forgotten. Meanwhile, Kettering's power over the community had grown absolute. He decided who could marry, who could work, who could eat. He arranged marriages between families to create loyalty networks that reported to him. He separated parents from children if he sensed any weakness in devotion. He had become a king in that isolated valley, ruling through fear and faith in equal measure. But Kettering had made one critical mistake. In his arrogance, he had underestimated the power of a parent's love and the determination of someone with nothing left to lose. Martha Briggs, Samuel's sister, had never believed the story about her brother running away. She had been watching, waiting, and slowly gathering courage. She had seen Kettering take Samuel toward the meditation house that night. She had seen him return alone, and she had decided that whatever price she paid, she would uncover the truth. Martha began her investigation carefully, pretending to be the most devoted follower Kettering had. She volunteered for extra duties, praised his sermons, and never showed a hint of doubt. But late at night, she explored. She watched the meditation house from hidden spots in the forest. She noticed that Kettering visited it at odd hours, carrying supplies that made no sense for a place of meditation. And one night, when Kettering was away visiting another valley, Martha found her courage and approached the door with a crowbar she had hidden weeks before. Martha's hands shook as she worked the crowbar against the door of the meditation house. The metal scraped against wood, sounding impossibly loud in the silent night. Every few seconds she would freeze, listening for footsteps, terrified that Kettering would appear behind her. But the church grounds remained empty. The preacher had left that afternoon for a neighboring valley, spreading his influence to another isolated community. She had maybe 6 hours before he returned. The lock finally broke. The door swung inward, releasing a smell that made Martha gag. Rot and waste and unwashed bodies. The darkness inside was complete. She had brought a flashlight, an old one her father had owned, hidden away before Kettering had banned such worldly items. The beam cut through the black, revealing a small room with stone walls and a dirt floor. Empty except for a trapdoor in the corner. Her heart hammered as she pulled the trapdoor open. Stairs descended into deeper darkness. The smell grew worse. She forced herself down those steps, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly because her hands were shaking so badly. At the bottom, she found a low-ceiling chamber carved from the earth, damp and cold. And in that hellish space, she found them. 7 people in various states of collapse, chained to the walls, filthy, some unconscious, some staring at her flashlight beam like they had forgotten what light was. Her brother Samuel was among them, though she almost didn't recognize him. He had lost so much weight that his face was skull-like. His eyes were empty holes. When she called his name, he didn't respond, just kept rocking back and forth, mumbling prayers. Martha wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but she had not come this far to fail. She worked quickly, using the crowbar to break the chains. Some of the prisoners were too weak to stand. Some babbled nonsense. Margaret Cole grabbed Martha's arm with surprising strength and whispered a single word over and over: monster. Getting them out of the basement was a nightmare. Martha had to drag some of them. Others crawled. Samuel moved like a ghost, following but not really present. She got them all into the main room of the meditation house and tried to wake them up, to make them understand they were being rescued. A few seemed to grasp it. Most were too far gone. That was when she heard the voice behind her. "You have made a grave mistake, Martha." Kettering stood in the doorway, blocking the exit. He must have returned early, or maybe he had never really left. Maybe he had been testing her all along, waiting to see if she would reveal her doubts. His face showed no anger, no surprise, just calm certainty. He looked at the freed prisoners like they were broken furniture, inconvenient but manageable. "These souls were beyond redemption," he said softly. "I gave them every chance to repent, to change. They refused. I did what was necessary to protect the flock from their corruption. You, Martha, have now joined them. You have chosen darkness." He stepped into the room, pulling the door shut behind him. In his hand was a heavy walking stick he always carried, the one he claimed had belonged to a saint. Martha realized with horror that he intended to kill her right there, to add her to his collection of disappeared. She looked around desperately for a weapon, for an escape, for anything. But salvation came from an unexpected source. Samuel, broken Samuel who had seemed completely lost, suddenly moved. Maybe some part of his mind had finally broken through the trauma. Maybe he recognized his sister's voice. Maybe he simply understood that this was his one chance. He threw himself at Kettering with a wordless scream, hitting him with the force of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. They struggled. The other prisoners stirred, slowly realizing what was happening. Margaret joined Samuel, then another, then another. Kettering fought like a trapped animal, vicious and desperate. But he was one man against 7 people who had nothing but revenge burning in their hearts. Martha ran. She ran out of that horrible place and down the hill toward the town. She screamed for help, pounding on doors, her voice raw. At first, no one answered. They were too afraid, too conditioned to ignore cries in the night. But Martha would not stop. She screamed about the basement, about the prisoners, about the monster in Preacher's clothing. Finally, a door opened, then another. Men emerged with lanterns and rifles, uncertain but armed. Martha led them back up the hill, talking desperately the whole way, trying to make them understand. By the time they reached the meditation house, it was over. Kettering lay motionless on the floor, the prisoners standing over him in a circle, breathing hard. The community of Hollow Creek stood in that doorway and saw the truth. They saw their missing neighbors, broken and scarred. They saw the chains and the filth and the evidence of years of torture. They saw Amos Kettering, the monster who had worn righteousness like a mask. The silence that followed was heavier than any sermon Kettering had ever preached. The men of Hollow Creek stood frozen, trying to reconcile the horror before them with the spiritual leader they had trusted. Some wept. Others turned away, unable to look. The rescued prisoners collapsed, their brief surge of strength completely spent. Kettering was dead. In their desperation to survive, the prisoners had gone too far. But not a single person in that room felt anything except relief. The monster was gone. The spell was broken. And slowly, like people waking from a nightmare, the community began to understand the depth of what had happened to them. The next few weeks were chaos. Families tried to care for the survivors, but most needed more help than simple mountain folk could provide. Samuel never fully recovered. He lived another 10 years, but his mind stayed fractured, trapped somewhere between the basement and reality. Margaret eventually left Hollow Creek, unable to bear living in the place where she had suffered so much. Others simply faded away, their stories ending quietly in the years that followed. The community faced a terrible decision. They could report everything to authorities in the county seat, bringing police and journalists and attention to their valley. Or they could handle it themselves in the old mountain way. After long debates that sometimes turned into shouting matches, they chose secrecy. They were ashamed that they had been fooled, ashamed that they had looked away when neighbors disappeared. Ashamed that they had let one man's words override their own moral sense. They buried Kettering in an unmarked grave far from the church, deep in the forest where no one would accidentally stumble upon it. They burned the meditation house to the ground, destroying every piece of evidence. They filled in the basement with rocks and dirt until no trace remained. They scattered Kettering's belongings, his journals, his notes about his victims. Everything that proved he had existed, they erased. Then they made a pact. No one would speak of Amos Kettering again. Not to outsiders, not to children born after his reign, not even to each other. The story would die with them. Hollow Creek would pretend those 3 years had never happened, that the missing had simply moved away or died of natural causes. The community would forget, deliberately and completely, because remembering was too painful. And it worked. When people from outside asked about the old preacher, they received blank stares. Records disappeared. The church registry was rewritten. Kettering's name vanished from every document. When historians came decades later, researching Appalachian communities, they found no mention of him. It was as if he had never existed. The conspiracy of silence was perfect, but forgetting came at a cost. Hollow Creek never fully recovered. Trust between neighbors had been poisoned. Families moved away, seeking fresh starts in places where no one knew their shame. The population dwindled. The church sat empty for years because no one wanted to worship in a place touched by such evil. The valley itself seemed cursed, the mountains pressing in tighter, the shadows growing longer. Today, Hollow Creek barely exists. A handful of old houses remain, most abandoned. The church is a collapsing ruin, its roof caved in and its walls covered with vines. The forest has reclaimed the spot where the meditation house once stood. Travelers sometimes pass through, never knowing the horror that soaked into this soil. The name Amos Kettering appears in no historical record, no true crime book, no documentary. But the oldest residents, those few who remain and remember, carry the story in their silence. They know that evil does not always announce itself with horns and flames. Sometimes it wears a collar and carries a Bible. Sometimes it speaks in a voice that sounds like salvation. And sometimes the most terrible monsters are the ones we choose not to remember. Because forgetting is easier than facing what we allowed to happen. Easier than admitting we looked away when we should have acted. Easier than acknowledging that we are all capable of being fooled, of following darkness when it promises light. Amos Kettering was buried deep, not just in the ground, but in the collective memory of a community that learned too late the price of blind faith. Some evils are too terrible to remember. Some stories are too dark to tell. And somewhere in the mountains of Appalachia, beneath the trees and the moss and the weight of decades, a monster rests in an unmarked grave, forgotten by history, erased by shame. But the scars he left remain, carried silently by those who survived and those who looked away. If you ever find yourself in a dying mountain town where people will not meet your eyes, where the old church stands empty and where certain questions receive only silence, you might have found Hollow Creek. And you will have discovered a secret that an entire community chose to bury rather than face. The monster is gone, but the guilt remains. And that is the most haunting part of all.